Hi everybody, Andrew Cuneo here. Today I wanted to do a little bit of a check-in. We're week one into the new standard format with Streets of New Capenna, and I wanted to break down two lists, 5 cards that have overperformed my expectations for them, and 5 cards that have underperformed my expectations from Streets of New Capenna in this new standard format. I've been playing a lot, and I think I'm starting to figure out some of the ways the new set's going to impact the set. So let's get to it. I'm going to start out with my 5 underperforming cards, and I'm going to start at number 5 with Titan of Industry. So this, I think, is the most appealing payoff for being a green ramp strategy. And it's on the underperformers list for a couple of reasons. I'm not saying it's a bad card, I'm just saying that it hasn't really lived up to my expectations for it. And that's for kind of 2 reasons. One is that even though you're getting, a 7/7 and a 4/4, so you're getting 11 power and toughness from, one 7-mana card, I found that there are a lot of decks that can kind of actually just go over the top of that. If you're playing against a runes deck, the 7/7 really isn't going to be that good of a blocker, probably. The runes deck's just going to be able to get an even larger creature. If you're playing against a deck that has raphine in it, that's, raphine can also potentially produce a creature that's big enough that the Titan of Industry can't even block it. And so that's been a little bit disappointing. The other thing that's been disappointing about this card is the shield counter ability is just not very good and constructed, has been my experience. So I think 2 of the most popular ways for people to remove creatures are Vanishing Verse and the Wandering Emperor. And your shield counter doesn't do anything against either of those in terms of removal. So it just winds up that this 7-mana 7/7 is actually just not a very durable creature. I'm not saying that this card is absolutely unplayable, but I am saying that it's not amazing in Standard. All right, let's move on. Coming in at number 4, Gala Greeters. And this is one that I didn't really have particularly high expectations for going into Standard, but I have to say that this card is just terrible. It's really, really bad. I've had a fair number of people cast it against me. I played with it a little bit, and it's just so much worse than Prosperous Innkeepers. I don't think that this is a reasonable card to put in your deck at all. So really just not much more to say about it than that. This card, I think, is just flat out bad. So that's why it's made this underperformers list. Coming in at number 3, and this might be a surprise to people, is Obnixalis. Now, Obnixalis is definitely a good card, but it made my list of underperformers because I don't think it's really come close to living up to the hype that we had going into the start of the Standard and after day 1 of the Arena Streamer Showcase. There were people talking about, Obnixalis is so great, we might need to see it banned. And I don't think I don't think we need to see it banned. I don't think it's really that great. The problem with this card is it's a really one-dimensional card in that it's very good at really punishing decks that are a little bit slow to play to the board, that aren't particularly good at killing opposing planeswalkers. The problem with it is that most of the good decks in Standard are really good at playing to the board. They're looking to play a creature on the second turn. They're looking to play something on the third turn that, might be an evasive creature that your Devil token isn't even going to be able to block. Certainly whatever someone's going to play on turn 3 is going to be good enough that a Devil token blocking it is rarely going to be very effective. I guess the Devil token lines up okay against Fable of the Mirror Breaker, but everything else makes the Devil token look pretty poor. So I think what has happened is that Obnixalis would be a good card in a format where the kind of lower to the ground decks were not that popular, where it was much more about kind of later game control decks that would be struggling against it. But Obnixalis is kind of pushing those decks out of the format, and honestly, those decks just weren't that well situated even when Obnixalis wasn't a part of the format. So I think this is a respectable card, but I don't think that it is going to be a dominant card in the standard. I don't think it's going to be regarded as the best card in Streets of New Capenna when all is said and done. I think there are just other cards are going to wind up being more important to standard, and I'm not sure that this card's going to have any legs going back to older formats. I mean, possibly as a sideboard card. I think the way that this card is going to fit in standard is it's going to be perhaps more of a sideboard card out of Jund decks or Rakdos decks that are looking for a good sideboard card against like blue-red control decks, if that becomes a deck you want to sideboard against. But I think this is not really going to be a card that you want to have 4 of in your main deck going forward in standard. So it's been a bit of a flop in that sense. Moving on to number 2, and here I've got Riveteers Charm. Honestly, this could just be all of the charms. I don't think any of them have really proven to be particularly good. Obscura Charm showed up in like very small numbers in the One Magic Online Standard Challenge that we've gotten deck lists from. I played a little bit with Riveteers Charm, and it's not horrible, but it's not great. I kind of decided it was a card I really didn't want 4 of in my main deck. One of the problems is just with Riveteers Charm specifically is that it's just kind of in direct competition with Fables of the Mirror Breaker at the 3-drop slot on the curve, and it just isn't as good as Fables of the Mirror Breaker. So it's been disappointing, and I think it's kind of a shame because I think that when people saw Charms were coming back, people were excited to get to play with Charms again. Charms are generally pretty fun cards to play with because you get to make a decision about what mode to use, their instance, so you get to decide about, when's the best time to cast them. So there's a ton of flexibility on the Charms, but I don't think they're really efficient enough to compete with kind of the higher power level, very efficient decks that we're seeing show up in this standard. So Riveteers Charm is going to make the list at number 2, but if you wanted to swap it out for Obscura Charm or Broker's Charm, I wouldn't argue with you. And then coming in at number 1, it's voidrend. Voidrend is terrible. You just cannot afford to spend 3 mana to destroy permanents in this format. This card always kills something at a disadvantage. There's nothing anybody's ever going to cast where you're going to spend 3 mana to kill it and you're really going to feel like, yes, I got a very good deal here. Like every permanent somebody's going to put into play that costs 3 or more mana is going to have some sort of comes into play ability or be a planeswalker, so they're going to activate it before you get to do anything. This card is just absolutely not a playable card in standard. It's really, really poor. And also the spell can't be countered line on it's close to doing nothing. I'm not going to say it does absolutely nothing, because every once in a while you would be able to kill something that has ward on it, like a Graveyard Trespasser or raphine. But the idea that people are actually going to be playing like negate to protect their stuff, it really doesn't play out that way. You can generally do better with your removal just by looking at the 2 mana options like Vanishing Verse. And if you're not satisfied with Vanishing Verse, the solution isn't to go to Voidrend, it's just don't play removal. Like you can't put 3 mana 1-for-1 removal in your deck in standard and be successful, I think. So that's why I've got this at number 1. Really big flop from this card. All right, let's move on to some of the more positive things that I've got on my list of overperformers. And I'm going to start at number 5 with Giada, Font of Hope. Now, this is a card that I think when we saw it previewed, everybody realized, okay, well, this is going to be a really good card in the Angel deck, but is the Angel deck actually going to be a good deck? And I at least was in the camp of probably not. I mean, it's a good card in a bad deck was my expectation. And I'm not sure that it's a good card in a good deck yet, but it's been better than I was expecting, which is why it's in the Overperformers list. It turns out you can just get some incredibly strong draws with Giada if your opponent can't kill it. If you get to, have it in play for 2 or 3 turns, your board is just going to become absolutely gigantic. And a lot of decks struggle to deal with that because, like I was saying when I was talking about voidrend, it's just really hard to have a lot of removal in your deck because there just isn't that much removal that's actually efficient enough to play, which means that your giada just doesn't always die. So this card it's certainly done better than I expected. I don't know that I'm going to say that Angels is actually a top tier deck, but I think it is a respectable deck. Moving on to number 4, we've got the Workshop War Chief, our kind of Thragtusk throwback card. And this made the list for Overperformers, not because I think it's a great card or it's going to be like a format staple, but it has shown up some, and I think it's been generally pretty respectable in the spots where it did show up. In that standard challenge I was talking about for Magic Online, I think the second place deck was like a white-green ramp deck that was using this card, or it was more like a white-green mid-range deck, I suppose. But this card, it actually kind of does enough, which is a little bit surprising. But it's been reasonably respectable. I still don't think you want to start a deck with 4 copies of this in your main deck, but if you wind up having a few copies of this in your deck, it's generally serviceable, which I wouldn't have guessed. Coming in at number 3, in the Overperformers list, we've got Tenacious Underdog. Now, the Tenacious Underdog was a card that I thought was going to be pretty good going into Standard after we saw it previewed, and it's honestly, it's overperformed my expectations that it was going to be pretty good. This has just been a really, really strong card. A lot of the kind of Esper mid-range decks are just playing 4 copies of it. Even the Rakdos decks that are kind of more sacrifice focused, or they're looking to set up Obnixalis, they're playing at least some copies of this. Arguably in Rakdos, there are some other options for sacrifice fodder that you might prefer. But even still in that case, this card, does make the deck list in some numbers. I think this is just overall a really strong card. I think the more the format goes on, the more this is going to show up as 4-ofs in top-tier decks. It's just great. It's one of the things that you need in this format is you really want to get on the board on turn 2. So you want to play a good number of 2-drops, but you want your 2-drops to be something that scales, so that it's not useless if you draw it later on in the game. And the Blitz ability on this card really means that it stays relevant for pretty much the whole game. At a minimum, you can draw it, and if it's not a good card, you can spend 4 mana to kind of cycle it away, and you've got a 3-power haste for the turn. It does it gets blitzed from the graveyard pretty routinely in games. So just overall, very strong card. And honestly, it's been strong enough that it started influencing how I want to build my sideboards, what kind of removal I want to play. It's made my stock in Flame Blessed Bolt go up a fair amount just because you want some amount of removal that can exile this. Of course, the most popular removal, which I would say is Vanishing Verse and the Wandering Emperor, they are good at exiling this. But in both cases, you're not really taking that bad of a trade. If they're using their 2-mana removal spell on your 2-drop, it's not that big of a deal. If they're using a Wandering Emperor to exile your 2-drop or to exile your 2-drop once it's been blitzed from the graveyard, again, it's not ideal, but it's not a disaster. So I think this card is just all around very strong. Coming in at number 2, we have another candidate for possibly the best card in the set, Raphine. And this is one that when I saw it on the spoiler, I thought, okay, that, this is doing a lot for 3 mana, but maybe it's not quite doing enough. Maybe it's not going to be quite durable enough. But it turns out this card is really, really good. This card sort of plays out like Adeline, but it's less dependent on you having a good 2-drop that's stuck into play. It's a little bit more durable, both because it has Ward and because it can't be hit by Vanishing Verse. And I think it kind of runs away with the game even better than Adeline does if it's left unchecked, because it fixes your hand as the game goes on. If you've put stuff in your deck like Tenacious Underdog that's useful from the graveyard, you're actually generating card advantage a lot of the time when you connive. This is just, I think, just all-around great card, and a lot of copies of it showed up in the top 8 of the one tournament we've seen. on the ladder on Arena. I think that generally this kind of Esper mid-range deck with 4 raphines in it's been one of the strongest decks I've gotten paired against. So I think this is just really, really strong card, and I think a lot of people were sleeping on it before, we got to start playing with the card. Certainly I was sleeping on it a little bit. Then coming in at number 1, I've got the new Elsmeth, and I went back and forth whether Elsmeth should be number 1 or raphine should be number 1. Elsmeth made the list at number 1 just because I think it's gone into a wider variety of decks. It's shown up in the kind of Esper mid-range deck, but it's also shown up in, there was a mono white control deck that won the Standard Challenge. It was there. It's shown up in like white-green mid-range decks. It's shown up in, Naya decks of various forms. It's really just shown up all over the place in almost every white deck. You're starting to see this card show up, and it not as a 4 of generally, but as a 1 to 3 of. It's shown up a lot, and it really is a very powerful card. If it's left unchecked, it's going to win the game for you. It allows you to potentially swing games back in your favor. If you've got a creature in play and you start giving it lifelink, you can get really huge life swings to allow you to make up some tempo if you've been on the back foot earlier on in the game. It's just all in all a really strong card. I thought going into Standard that it was going to be a good card. I thought it was not going to be as good as the Wandering Emperor, and I think that has mostly borne itself out. I don't think this card is as good as the Wandering Emperor, but it's been even better than I expected. It's been closer to the Wandering Emperor than I thought it was going to be. So that's why I've got it at number 1. That's all I've got for today. I hope you guys found this kind of brief insights into Standard useful. And if you did, please leave a comment. I'm sure that there are plenty of things you might disagree with on the list, but this is my list. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.